First of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you all for being here. And yes, I recognize some of you. This is very much an area of which all three of us are, highly invested. I'm Alexa Posney, and I'm the Senior Vice President at Renaissance Learning. Before I joined Renaissance, I was the Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. I'm also the former chair of the NAGB's Board Special Education Task Force, and I will talk about that briefly. In recent years, and as you've heard, the nation's report card has come up with some very innovative ways to test and report on students with special needs. As everyone here knows, there continues to be a great need to focus on the policy decisions related to this very critical issue. Today we'll discuss what new challenges we face and what opportunities exist as we continue to work to accurately assess and to improve student performance among all people, all kids with exceptional educational needs. Joining me today for this discussion are Lou Danielson, who is the Managing Director of the American Institutes for Research. And just so you know, I had the great opportunity to work with Lou when I was the Director of OSEP at the U.S. Department of Ed. And I'm very pleased to have with us Charlene Rivera, who is a research professor and executive director at the George Washington University Center for Equity and Excellence in Education. Thank you very much for coming. So with that, let's hear from Lou to begin.
Great. Thanks, Alexa. I'm currently at AAR, and I've been there for about the last 5 years. But prior to that, as Alexa indicated, I was in the U.S. Department of Education, and so I can provide I think I'll start off by providing a little bit of a historical perspective related to the participation of students with disabilities in the NAEP. My first kind of interaction with this is that I was the person in the Office of Special Ed Programs that was kind of the designee to collaborate with NCES around the assessment program, and that began in the early 1990s. And at that point, while there were students with disabilities that were included in the NAEP, there were no accommodations provided, and I would say probably no systematic attempt to ensure that significant numbers of students with disabilities participated. And so then, not surprisingly, there were fairly substantial exclusion rates. And at that time, during that period of time, there was a fair amount of attention focused on, I guess, what you might call differential exclusion rates. That is, if you looked at state rankings on the NAEP, you might see that, or people asserted that if it weren't for the differential exclusion rates, the rank orders would change by very substantial amounts. And I can't remember the exact number, but I believe at one time somebody pointed to California, and in California, partly because of the number of students with disabilities, but also English language learners, where there was exclusion of both populations. If their exclusion rate had been the same as the national average, it would have changed their rank order by, I don't know, remember the exact number, it might have been like 14 positions or something. So that early on, I think that was one of the very big factors that kind of drew attention to exclusion rates and participation of students with disabilities. The discussions that I became involved with, though, that probably influenced very dramatically the policies in the NAEP, which are those that are in place today. Conversations began again in the early 1990s during the Clinton administration, and I would say, while there had been a lot of kind of maybe kind of one-on-one conversations with the person that was the assistant secretary to OSERS at the time about this issue and about her concern about it, ultimately what transpired is a meeting with the undersecretary, with myself and 4 assistant secretaries, the head of OCR, OSERS, the general counsel, and the person. There was an OERI then. This was before the IES, and with the deputy secretary to talk about NAEP and a more inclusive NAEP. And what ended up coming from that meeting was what at the time I considered maybe just kind of punting on the issues, was to put together a blue ribbon panel on this issue. But as it turned out, the blue ribbon panel ultimately recommended, and one of the very big issues was the trend line. It was kind of interesting for those that might have been in the last session in the other room. there was some discussion about the importance of the trend line. And that was actually one of the big stumbling blocks in the sense that by including, dramatically increasing the participation of students with disabilities, that it would change the trend line. And so the recommendation that came out of the Blue Ribbon Committee was basically, on the face of it, it seemed like a pretty simple one, and surprising that we didn't suggest within the department was, we'll carry on with 2 trend lines for a while, and then at some point, the old trend line can be abandoned and you have a new trend line. And that, I would say that important recommendation that came from that Blue Ribbon panel was the thing that fundamentally then changed the nature of the conversation. So then the nature of the conversation really began to be about how do we go about creating a more inclusive NAEP, and discussions about accommodations and how we might sample and go forward with the NAEP. And that was I think culminated, I believe it was maybe around 1995, where there was a kind of a first administration of a NAEP with accommodations. And the issue that transpired after that, though, is that did not solve the presence of accommodations, or some accommodations did not solve the exclusion issue. And this exclusion issue has continued to be a really important issue. Alexa indicated she chaired a panel that took on this issue. I happened to also be on that panel, but I think the good news is and maybe the panel should take credit for this, but the good news, I think, since that panel, there has been some pretty dramatic reduction in the exclusion rates. Some of it perhaps because of a recommendation the panel made around, of course, we can't require administrators to include kids with disabilities, but to basically take a stronger position of urging test administrators to include kids with disabilities, describing the differences between the purposes of NAEP versus the purposes of state assessment. I mean, one of the big issues being that the state assessment and the NAEP have quite different purposes. Many kids with disabilities get accommodations in the state NAEP or state assessment that are not allowable accommodations in the NAEP, and feeling being that given the different purposes of the NAEP, that these kids should be included. And so that no doubt had some effect. The other thing that has no doubt had a large effect is that on the math assessment, the calculator accommodation was a big issue. NAEP has identified a set of items that I guess they're called calculator permissible, and is able to create a kind of a subset of those items, which for kids where a calculator accommodation is on the IP, they can get that, they can get those set of items, therefore could use the calculator. That's really reduced the exclusion rates for that, for kids on the math assessment, that it's less than 10% of kids with disabilities. Keeping in mind that there's always going to be some exclusion, at least based on the way the NAEP is currently, because kids that might otherwise be in what's called the alternate assessment against alternate achievement standards, principally kids with intellectual disabilities, would never be able to be assessed on a test like the NAEP is formulated currently. So the exclusion rates now are actually quite good. There's one other big issue in the NAEP, which is continues the reading assessment, because of the population of kids with reading disabilities who in the state assessment are permitted to take the reading exam as a read aloud assessment, and that's not a permissible accommodation in the NAEP. So and that is still an obstacle. So. And so we were kind of given permission to come up with some recommendations, and I would say, kind of despite the great progress that has been made, I think there continue to be some areas where as we think forward to the future, some steps could be taken that could improve the NAEP beyond where it is today. One of these, actually, I mentioned a moment ago. The department currently requires that states, in addition to the regular state assessment, have an alternate assessment for kids that have significant cognitive disabilities, and that's estimated to be about 1% of students, although only 1% of students can count as proficient on the assessment. There may be 2 or 3 or 4% of students of the entire school population, which represents maybe in the neighborhood of perhaps as much as 10% of the students with disabilities population that are assessed in this alternate assessment. If we would set a goal of 100% participation in the NAEP, that would only be possible if there were also an alternate for the NAEP. And the good news is that the alternate assessment requirements for states have only been in place since 2000, and the technology for doing that, the nature of the assessment, was pretty rudimentary. In fact, many states at the time, the early attempts to do it were basically to use portfolios of student work, which in my view were not particularly satisfactory. The good news is the technology has advanced substantially. And my view is the technology has advanced to a point now where it would be worthwhile to really consider the possibility of augmenting the NAEP with an alternate assessment. The advantage of that, then, in my view, is that it would be possible to have a goal that 100% of kids with disabilities could really be included in the NAEP. In addition, the movement to the computer-adapted testing has great potential for kids with disabilities because it depends on the grade, depends on the area, but something in the order of 40 to 50% of kids with disabilities are below basic, about 90% are below proficient, and one of the big challenges in the NAEP the way it is now is that it's very difficult. There'll be very few items that students at that level could attempt and pass, and so that has implications, of course, for how the precision of the estimate of students' abilities, but it also has a lot of implications for how kids feel when they're taking that assessment. In other words, one can imagine if you're taking an assessment where very few of the items that you're attempting, do you have any idea, what the answer is, that you're doing anything above basically guessing. So that it's for many of these kids, the assessment experience has got to be a pretty aversive experience. And so the advantage of the computer adaptive testing is that it can present items with difficulty levels that are more appropriate for the ability level of kids. But in addition, it provides a much more efficient way to provide many of the accommodations that kids might need, such as large print, in the items that permit the read aloud, for example, to read aloud refreshable braille. There are a lot of things that can be done with a computer administered assessment. So I think that those advances coming on board, I think, are terrific. One really important consideration, and this is something I would say that has been an issue in some of the state assessments as they've moved to computer adaptive testing, is in identifying the items, the easier items, the lower ability items, that states have sometimes gone to what are considered to be out of level, that is, lower grade level items. And in the work, AR has actually done a lot of work in this area, and we believe that it's possible to create items of appropriate difficulty level but are still based on grade level content, that you don't have to go into lower level content in order to develop those items, which I think is important. In addition, the NAEP collects data by disability category. It doesn't report that way. I think it would be very useful to the field to report NAEP results by disability category. For some of the categories, the numbers will be too small. That will probably require some kind of collapsing of some categories of disability, which I think my view would be fine. The final issue that I wanted to address, which I think in some ways is the toughest issue, is the read aloud and reading. And in the 2004 amendments to IDEA, it has a great deal of language around the obligations of states and school districts to provide accessible instructional materials. And one of the things that has led to is digitizing, well, first of all, the OSEP came up with standards for accessible technology, and those standards now have led to publishers providing basically digital textbooks to a clearinghouse that OSEP funds, which then in turn are converted into software so that they can be used by a variety of software programs that have been developed to support reading for kids who are dyslexic, or to create refreshable braille for kids who are blind, or to do other enhancements to text that students with disabilities might require. And I think one implications of that is that there are going to be many students with who are dyslexic, that is, they have reading disabilities, whose principal mode of acquiring information is through digital textbooks that are, and these students will rely on software that basically is supporting their reading. And not necessarily, for some students, it may mean that all words are read aloud. For some students, it may only mean some words are read aloud. But the fact that large numbers of students will be acquiring their content that way, and will for the remainder of their lives acquire content that way, I mean, suggests to me that we really need to consider the possibility of assessing students in the way in which they typically get their information. I think it's the PARC guidelines now suggests that kids above the 6th grade should be permitted to receive this reading aloud accommodation the way I suggested. And I think what drives the identification of grade 6 is that, for the most part, at that point, you're beyond the grades where the goal of English language arts is to teach kids to read. You know, pretty much once you get beyond there, the goal of reading is to acquire content, acquire information, and that an assessment for older students, that is above 6th grade, should be principally an assessment of their ability to acquire content, knowledge from text, regardless of the way in which they access the text. And so that pretty much covers my remarks.
Thank you very much, Lou.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to turn it over to Charlene.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, are the slides available, or is the clicker available? I do have. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and to have this opportunity to celebrate with NAGB on its 25th anniversary. I am going to talk about, I have been doing work with NAEP for many years. Actually, I was a NAEP scholar in the mid-'80s. So I'm going to mention some of that in this talk that I'm going to give. Essentially, the topic or the way I've addressed it is assessing ELs in NAEP. To what should we aspire? So these topics that I'm going to address really are the criteria for defining who is an EL, and then just any of them? Yeah, just any of them. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to talk about the criteria for defining who is an English language learner. I'm going to talk about inclusion policy and accommodation policies. Now, there are many other topics that we really could address around English language learners, but that may come through in the conversation, and I think the interaction will be good. But we could talk about, considering linguistic access for ELs in computer-based assessments. I guess, Lou, that's an area that you just mentioned that's important. And I think that the issues are parallel, not the same, but parallel, and there are issues for English language learners as well. But I just wanted to remind everyone that we're talking about a population of English language learners, and this is a diverse population. Some are foreign-born, some are U.S.-born. When we have young learners who are developing English language proficiency, and they come with different levels of English language proficiency. Some are making good academic progress, and others are struggling academically. We have adolescents who are also learning, in the process of learning English. But some of these, if they've been struggling as young learners, they may now be flipping over into what we call long-term English language learners. And then we have other learners who are on grade level academically, and those who are struggling academically. And finally, we have students who come with interrupted schooling or limited form of schooling. Now, you say, well, why am I putting all of this up? It's essentially to remind us that it's not a one-size-fits-all. We need to, if we're going to report on these students, it's important to take some of these characteristics into mind. And I guess that's one of the recommendations I'll make down the road about how NAEP might help to help us understand this student population better. But so if we talk about the criteria for defining who is an EL, currently there's no operational definition of LEP, and that's the term that was used in the past, limited English proficient. Today we use English language learner, a little bit more, a softer term, a little bit more inclusive feeling kind of term. But NAEP continues to not have an operational definition of LEP. What do they use? They provide criteria to schools, and that criteria is used then to include students in the assessment and to deliver the assessment. The operational definition is important, and we have PARC and Smarter Balance now trying to get together with their states to figure out how they can have a common definition of English language learner. It has importance for how you induct students into that classification and how you exit students into that classification. It also has some implications for who is part of that LEP or that English language learner group. Is it only those kids who are in the process of learning English, or is it also kids who have actually achieved the English proficient level? So should we include former English language learners also, or at least address, when we're reporting results, address this group as well? Historically, NAEP has had, many different kinds of inclusion, different kinds of approaches to inclusion. And initially, in 1964, when it was first founded, English language learners were not thought of. There was no such thing. They were there, but they were just simply excluded. In those days, what actually happened was that NAEP reported by race, ethnicity. So you reported by Asian, Hispanic, Black, white. And the way that it was done, essentially, this is a little history. I don't know how many of you know, but essentially it was the assessor who decided whether the person was Black or white or Hispanic or Asian. So in this room, for example, I would decide that that there were 5 whites and 3 Blacks, or 1 Asian, 1 Hispanic, and that was the way that the results were reported. So in 1985, when I went to ETS and as a NAEP scholar, I conducted a study to look at how this affected, whether self-identification might not be a better process. And so actually, through that work, NAEP considered that work, and we did find that self-identification for Hispanics in particular was not accurate, was accurate, but that visual identification was not. For Black and white, it made no difference, but it was definitely an improvement for Hispanic students. So NAEP considered that, took that under consideration, as well as the changing times. And that's when we began to see that they started to think about using reporting race ethnicity based on self-report, and that has happened. But in the 1994, they began, in the 90s, they started to start thinking about more inclusionary processes. The laws had changed, the federal legislation had changed. We have ESEA coming along, the Improving America Schools Act, which said we should be more inclusive and we should be reporting on all students, not just certain groups of students. And so with that, you can see these inclusion policies. I'm not going to go over them, but we've gone from total exclusion to trying to be maximally inclusive. And there has been in the middle, you'll see sort of this 3-year rule. People have tried to figure out, should the kids be assessed after being in an English program after 3 years, or should they not be assessed? And so we've gone to the point now where we are saying that if a student has been in a program for at least a year, they can be included with accommodations. And so that is where we are with the inclusion policies. So what are the benefits? To improve, including more students, there's improved measurement, the NAEP results are enhanced, there's more generalizability to the data, and greater fairness of the and equity, possibly. So what are the challenges? Mm-hmm. And this is really the big thing, the comparability. Yep. Upholding the validity of the trend data and the other part of NAEP that isn't the trend data per se. But that has been a challenge, and I know that for the statisticians who have worked on this, this has been an issue. Then maintaining reliability, of course. But there is a whole issue with reliability, and for English language learners, it's the way that the policy is implemented. There is a policy, yes, ELs should be included, and the assessors know that, but there is not a consistency in how this policy is implemented. So you have assessors in different states making decisions about whether an English language learner should or should not be included, and they make the decisions based on different criteria. So we don't have consistency. Of course, we're trying to preserve the ability to analyze and report trends in this. And so this is important to keep in mind. So these are the challenges. I'm just going to jump a little bit. In 1994, NAGB did become very interested in this whole issue of accommodations. And so I was asked to author a paper for NAGB around state assessment policies and to talk about accommodations for English language learner. What the paper does is document research on accommodations and recommends use of an EL responsive accommodation taxonomy. The accommodations that were introduced at NAEP initially were based on students with disabilities and did not distinguish for English language learners. Mm-hmm. So this was a new way of thinking about this, and one that I would continue to encourage thinking about. We do need to think about English language learners have a linguistic need to access the test. They do not have a disability. So there is a difference in the way to look at those two groups of students. The inconsistencies, we did a study in 2009 with the urban districts, and we looked at 4 districts in how they actually accomplished this inclusion. And basically, I have a slide up here that says the state comparisons may not be comparable across states. But in this other study, what we found was that at least half of these were decision makers making the decisions about whether to include or not include. And about half of the decision makers across the 4 districts that where we worked thought that accommodations could only be provided to students with disabilities or to students with an IEP. And this has great implications because what we're doing is conflating, again, students with disabilities with English language learners. And so we're reducing the number of students that are actually being assessed in the assessment. Some decision makers who did assign accommodations to ELLs expressed confusion about the criteria which should be used to match testing accommodations to ELs' needs. So, in summary, there's inconsistent use. Here's another area of research that is important to keep in mind. And this is Rebecca Kopriva's work, where she basically found that there's inconsistency in the use of teacher judgment to assign accommodations. She found that there was that teacher judgment was no better than random assignment of accommodations to students. Students assigned accommodations based on individual needs did better in the math assessment, and students who were inappropriately assigned did no better than students without accommodations. So this points to the whole point that we have the training that needs to go on for the assessors if they're going to do this well. So to what should we aspire? Of course, we want to have valid assessments, but we also want to recognize the diversity of English language learners. We want to consistently include ELLs in providing ELs with linguistic access to the content of the assessments. We want to differentiate accommodations for ELs at different levels of English language proficiency. I haven't really mentioned this, but we have to really consider that ELs are growing in learning the language. They learn it every day. And so we really need to distinguish, and it would be great if NAEP were able to do that. We need to monitor the implementation of criteria for including English language learners. That is how state assessors actually do this. We need to use student background variables to inform selection of appropriate accommodations, and these should be based on a consistent operational definition of an English language learner. Now, I don't know whether we'll come to that point or not, or whether NAEP will be able to actually do that, but it would be ideal if we could. We need to also consider students' level of English language proficiency and the language of instruction. If the student is not being instructed in English, perhaps we should be testing them in another language, or vice versa. So, and then I would advocate for using the EL responsive framework as a tool for selecting appropriate accommodations, and of course using research as a base. And finally, I would recommend that NAEP consider tracking and reporting results for English language learners and former English language learners, taking into consideration the level of English language proficiency and other background variables. I will like to end with this one slide that I've got. This is our goal. This is what we should aspire to, that all kids, can reach high levels of proficiency and are able to carry on in our society. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Charlene. She raised a point, and I'm going to share a few things with you, but I really would like to open it up for questions if we can. But one of the other, things that could conflate, think about a child who is both EL as well as a child with a disability.
That's correct.
And that even confounds what it is that we're talking about. And when you were talking about eligibility, and I thought eligibility for a child with a disability differs, and I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but it differs amongst the states, and it even differs within states itself, because you can be in one school in one district and be in another one, and the child will be eligible in one and not in another. So yes, these are real issues that we deal with. When I think about what I just want to share with you and talk with you about, 40 years ago, and it's 40 years, PL 94-142 was crafted. And think about it that time, because there were almost 2 million kids with disabilities that couldn't even enter a school door. They were completely and totally excluded from the public school system. And look at what we have today. We have almost 7 million kids with disabilities who are being served in inclusive settings across this country. That's the level of growth that we have seen, and you talked about it. It's the same way with ELs. Kids are being served. But are there still more things that we can do? The answer is absolutely yes. Arnie has talked about this many, many times, and he said in one of the speeches that he gave, he said, in 2007, nearly 60% of students with disabilities graduated from high school, compared to only 32% 20 years earlier. But think about it now, there are 44% of our kids with disabilities who don't even make it to graduation. And of the 56% of the students with disabilities who do graduate, only 53% enroll in some post-secondary. And of the number of kids that complete their post-secondary, we don't have strong numbers, but we're talking maybe 2 to 3% of the population. That's where NAGB and NAEP plays such an important role in terms of holding all of our kids to the same level of aspiration that we want. In the Common Core document that was originally developed by CCSSO and NGA, they clearly stated within that document, all students, including students with disabilities, must be challenged to excel within the general curriculum and prepared for success in their post-school lives. They know exactly how important it is. And Arnie said, only last year, he said, no belief is more damaging in education than the misperception that children with disabilities cannot really succeed and shouldn't be challenged to reach the same high standards as all children. And that's exactly what NAEP is trying to show. So this task force that developed the paper that I led in 2009, and the paper and the recommendations that came out in 2009, there were some statements that were made to show the importance of both students with disabilities and ELs in terms of what we want. We said it was imperative that samples of students tested at the national, state, and district levels should be fully representative of the population. And we know that each student who participates as part of NAEP represents hundreds of other similar kids. And we want this representation to be there. And exclusion of any of these kids has not been uniformly achieved across districts at the time that this paper was done, within assessment years and over times. And the percentages of exclusions for specifically students with disabilities at the time we were writing that paper ranged from 6% of the population to excluding over 70% of all kids with disabilities across all of the states. The exclusion rates were incredibly high. What we know is that the wide variability in these exclusion rates raises questions in terms of the achievement data that we're seeing. And that is still one of the issues, and I want to get there. The goal of NAEP and the goal that NAGB has set is that we want to ensure that all the tested samples of the kids across this country are as representative as possible of the population that's in there, and that everyone can participate meaningfully in the NAEP assessment, which is why I liked hearing about, you had some thoughts about how we might be able to be more inclusive. And the appropriate use of accommodations is absolutely huge. I ran into Terry Holliday just as we were coming in here. And Terry, because I went back through the minutes, Terry Holliday is the chief state school officer in Kentucky. And what I told him is I said, and I want to share some of this data, what has changed in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of inclusion rates? I want to share that with you. And what I was explaining to Terry is I said, I'm going to talk about Kentucky, because Kentucky, you have taken it upon yourself to increase the inclusion rate of kids with disabilities, and that's even knowing that Kentucky state assessment allows as an accommodation for the reading assessment to be read aloud. Knowing that, they did that in Kentucky, even though they knew that that was a different accommodation not allowed on NAEP. So just in terms of the percentage, and this is comparing the year 2009 with the year 2013 in terms of exclusion rates. And what I want to do is I want to highlight like the top 5 states that showed that the greatest increase in states, as well as the District of Columbia. Because the District of Columbia is the one that by far, in 2009, they excluded 68% of students with disabilities in grade 4 for reading. 4 years later, in 2013, they had 8%. They reduced the exclusion rate by 60%. Kentucky went from 48% to 19%, a 29% a more inclusive rate. New Jersey, 47 to 9. New Mexico, 36 to 7. Oklahoma, 45 to 9. Tennessee, 62% to 18%. And then in terms of their scaled scores, and this is where there is still, I don't want to say an issue, but this is still where we're trying to figure out what to do with this and how does this impact the scaled score? Because the big thing are the trend lines, because it is so incredibly different. Now that's fourth grade reading. And just in terms of the scaled scores that were shown at that time, the District of Columbia had a scale score in 2009 of 2002. In 2013, it was 2006. So it went up. Now, in terms of 8th grade reading, students with disabilities, again, the District of Columbia went from 68% exclusion to 5%. Kentucky, 55 to 27. New York, 34 to 3. So Ohio, 45 to 14. South Carolina, 42 to 14. Now, in terms of math exclusion rates were slightly less. And they were slightly less. Why? Because one of the accommodations that you can have on the math assessment is it can be read to you. So those kids who have problems or a disability or an issue in terms of learning to read, that doesn't become that much of an issue. But to tell you, 4th grade in math, District of Columbia excluded 27% of their kids in 2009, and it's down to 6% now. Massachusetts went from 25 to 9. Oklahoma, 26 to 10. Texas, 28 to 11. And in terms of 8th grade math, the District of Columbia went from 34% to 2%. So when you begin to look at these, and Texas went from 39 to 12, this was the whole point of what the paper and the panel and the task force was trying to do. And I want to thank NAGB and NAEP in terms of doing that. Because, this is a quote that I've used over and over again. There is a greater tragedy than being labeled as a slow learner, and that's being treated as one. We want to know what kids know in relationship to the standards that we have in terms of NAEP and what's on the assessments. And we can't do that if we don't include them and if we don't have them as part of this system. Because we want to know that we have helped absolutely every single child. Now, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but what I wanted to do in one of the areas and the recommendations that we came up with, from this task force and so forth, it was to have the accommodations become more, so we know exactly what they are and which ones can have them, and that was for both. And we know which ones are allowable now. It's very clear out there. There is a decision tree that helps people make the decisions to decide how a child will be tested. But one of the still confounding factors, or one of the still issues that's out there, is that students who refuse to take the assessment are not classified as exclusions. Rather, they're placed under refusals. What this does is this creates an issue, a possible issue with the trend lines. And it goes something like this. If students were converted from exclusions to refusals, this can and does disrupt comparisons with past results where exclusions were substantial. And what this could artificially do is increase inclusion rates because they're now classified as refusals and not exclusions, but it would lower participation rates because there would be more refusals. And it could take it down to like less than 85%, which is the goal of what we want in terms of being inclusive. So there are different ideas out there, and I know this is going way beyond, but it's taking a look at, do we make some adjustments when we think about how we are reporting this data? Adjustments made for refusals or absent students. Do we use full population estimates that adjust state and district results by imputing scores for excluded students? And do we publish a total participation rate based on all students in the sample, divided into those tested and those not tested? And what we currently do is the reported participation rates are calculated after excluded students are subtracted from the number in the sample. So these are just some of the issues that are still out there in terms of what we want to do. But I don't want to leave it on that note. What I really would like to do is, and I want to ask both Shirlene and Lou, is what's next? If you had those one or two things to say, what should NAGB or what should NAEP do? What should we do next? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I guess I think that we should be considering the background variables for English language learners, and that reporting should actually be done from that perspective so that we can get a better understanding of this population, and that it isn't just, just this general understanding, and especially English language proficiency, reporting it and somehow linking it back to where those students are. I know that NAEP has, has thought about this. Al Beaton in I think 2002 wrote a paper for NAGB where he recommended that they actually create an English language proficiency measure that would be administered at the same time as the NAEP assessment, so that there would be a common understanding of who these ELL students or LEP students were in the assessment. Now that hasn't come to be, but maybe there's other ways of thinking about how to connect that information to the assessment. But I mean, for PARCC and Smarter Balance, it's the same. It's the same issue. How do they link? Right. How does the content assessment relate to the English language proficiency assessment, and how do those two help to move us forward in understanding this student population?
That's a great suggestion, and I have to admit, when I was the assistant secretary for OSERS, we did meet with PARCC and Smarter Balance to deal with exactly these same kinds of issues, to figure out, let's do it up front, let's not do it after the fact. And did we get it perfect? No, but I'm really looking to them. Lou, how about you?
I think probably work on like a national alternate assessment, because I think that one of the things that the NAEP has done is it's really created advancements in assessment practices and that have influenced not just national assessment, but also influenced state and local assessments. And I think it's an area where I think the state practices on their alternate have actually advanced considerably, but I think that, and it's pretty remarkable in a way because it's such a short period of time. And if you look at our entire history of achievement testing, is a very long history, but for the portion that's really dealt with alternate assessments, it's been a very short period of time, and I think we've come a long ways, but I think there's a lot of advancements that could be made, and so I think that would make a great contribution to take that on.
The one other thing I would like to suggest is that, I realize, you're advocating for students with disabilities, I'm advocating for English language learners, but that we really distinguish the two groups and determine where we're common, where it's not common, and what we need to do to make things move forward.
That's exactly right. Because I want you to understand there was also a task force that was for ELL at the exact same time we had the special ed one. I'm sorry to say our time is up. I would have loved to have had, questions from the audience, but, feel free to ask us at any other point. And I just want to say thank you to all of you, and thank you for having this as, something in which you are very much concerned. Thank you.